When a CEO shows up at your door in the rain after you've just quit, you expect anger, maybe threats. What you don't expect is vulnerability. Evan Brooks had spent 3 years building walls between himself and Claire Harrington. Professional distance, emotional barriers, all the armor a good operations director needs when working for a woman who could command a room with a glance. He thought walking away from Harrington Global would be the end of it. He was wrong. Because the woman standing on his doorstep wasn't wearing her corporate mask anymore. And the words she was about to say would shatter everything he thought he knew about why he'd really resigned. If you want to see how a resignation letter becomes a love confession, stick around until the end. And hey, drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels. The rain fell like judgment on Seattle, turning 4th Avenue into rivers of neon reflection and regret. Evan Brooks sat in his apartment, 300 square feet of IKEA furniture and abandoned ambition, staring at the resignation letter he'd submitted 4 days ago. The paper was already yellowing at the edges, or maybe that was just the dim lighting making everything look as tired as he felt. His phone buzzed. Another message from Marcus, his former colleague, asking if he was okay. Evan didn't answer. He hadn't answered any of them. Not Marcus, not the HR director who'd called twice, not even his sister who'd sent increasingly concerned texts about making rash decisions. Because the truth was, he wasn't okay. But he also wasn't wrong. The apartment smelled like microwaved Chinese food and the kind of stale air that accumulates when you haven't opened the windows in days. Evan had stopped opening windows somewhere around the 3rd consecutive 18-hour workday. Stopped a lot of things, actually. Eating regular meals, returning calls, pretending that building someone else's empire was the same as building a life. He was 29 years old and felt 60. That's what 3 years at Harrington Global did to you. Ground you down until you were nothing but efficiency metrics and strategic synergies, until you forgot there was supposed to be something more than quarterly reports and merger negotiations. The coffee table was littered with evidence of his unraveling. Empty beer bottles, half-read books on burnout and recovery, a stack of unopened mail that probably included final notices on things he'd forgotten mattered. His laptop sat open, the screen dark, cursor blinking in a blank document where he'd tried 6 times to write out why he'd really quit. Because I was drowning didn't seem professional enough. Because I couldn't look at her anymore without wanting things I had no right to want seemed too honest. Because staying would have killed me. But leaving might actually finish the job. Well, that was just depressing. The knock on the door came at 9:47 p.m., sharp and insistent, cutting through the white noise of rain and despair. Evan didn't move. Probably Marcus coming to do a wellness check, or maybe his sister who lived across town and had threatened to come over there and make sure you're still breathing after he'd ignored her last 3 calls. The knock came again, harder this time. "I'm fine," Evan called out, not moving from the couch. "Go away." "Evan?" The voice stopped his heart. It was impossible. Absolutely, completely impossible. Because that voice, low and controlled, the kind that could silence a boardroom or negotiate a billion-dollar deal, belonged to Claire Harrington. And Claire Harrington did not show up at the apartments of former employees at 10 o'clock on rainy Friday nights. Claire Harrington sent emails, made phone calls through her assistant, operated from positions of power and control. She didn't stand in hallways of mediocre apartment buildings in Lower Queen Anne, getting soaked because the roof leaked in 3 places and the landlord didn't care. "Evan, I know you're in there. Open the door." He stood slowly, his body moving before his brain caught up. Through the peephole, he could see her, and the sight knocked whatever remained of his composure completely sideways. Claire Harrington, CEO of Harrington Global, stood in his hallway wearing jeans. Not the designer slacks she favored for business casual Fridays, but actual jeans, dark-washed and perfectly fitted. A gray sweater that looked expensive even through fisheye distortion. Her hair, usually pulled back in that severe bun that made her look untouchable, fell loose around her shoulders, dark and rain-soaked. She looked human. Terrifyingly, devastatingly human. Evan opened the door. Water dripped from her hair onto his doormat, which read, "Welcome," in faded letters that had stopped meaning anything years ago. Her mascara had run slightly, leaving shadow smudges under those green eyes that had watched him across conference tables for 3 years. She was shivering. "Can I come in?" she asked, and her voice cracked on the last word. Evan stepped back. She walked past him, bringing the smell of rain and expensive perfume into his apartment, and he watched her take in the chaos, the bottles, the books, the evidence of a man coming apart at the seams. "I'm sorry," he said automatically, gesturing vaguely at the mess. "I wasn't expecting... I didn't think... Stop." Claire turned to face him, and the look in her eyes was something he'd never seen before. Something raw. "I didn't come here for apologies." "Then why did you come?" She was quiet for a long moment, water still dripping from her hair onto his floor, creating small puddles that caught the lamplight. Outside, thunder rumbled. The building's old radiator clanked and hissed. "I accepted your resignation," she said finally. "I know, I got the email. But I didn't accept losing you." The words hung between them like smoke, like possibility, like every conversation they'd never had in 3 years of late nights and early mornings, of working dinners and strategy sessions that ran until dawn. Evan felt something crack inside his chest, something that had been holding him together through sheer force of will and professional distance. "Claire, don't," she interrupted. "Please, I've been practicing this for 4 days, and if you interrupt me, I'm going to lose my nerve completely." She was shaking, actually shaking. The woman who'd faced down hostile board members and activist shareholders without blinking stood in his apartment, trembling like a leaf. "Okay," Evan managed. "Okay." Claire closed her eyes, took a breath. When she opened them again, she looked directly at him with an intensity that felt like being seen for the first time in his life. "You quit on Monday," she said. "By Tuesday, I'd read your resignation letter 17 times. By Wednesday, I'd drafted 12 different responses and deleted every single one. By Thursday, I realized I was trying to find a professional way to say something that had stopped being professional a long time ago." Evan's pulse hammered in his throat. "Claire, I'm not here as your boss," she continued, words spilling out faster now. "I'm not here to offer you your job back, or to negotiate, or to do any of the things a CEO should do when her operations director walks away. I'm here because..." She swallowed hard. "Because I've spent 4 days pretending I was fine, and I'm not fine, Evan. I'm the opposite of fine." "You came all the way here to tell me you're not fine?" "I came all the way here because you were right." That stopped him. "About what?" "Your resignation letter. The part where you said you couldn't keep building someone else's dream while your own life fell apart. The part where you said you'd forgotten what it felt like to want something just because you wanted it, not because it served a strategic purpose." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "You were right about all of it, and I knew you were right because I've been living the exact same way for 10 years. Rain hammered against the windows. Somewhere in the building, someone's television played too loud, a laugh track for a joke neither of them had heard. "I don't understand, but..." Evan said. "You're Claire Harrington. You built a company from nothing. You're living your dream." "Am I?" She laughed, bitter and broken. "My marriage ended because I chose conference calls over conversations. I haven't seen my brother in 2 years because I'm always too busy. I can't remember the last time I did something that wasn't calculated for maximum strategic impact." She took a step closer. "And then you came along and ruined everything." "I ruined..." "You made me remember what it felt like to want something I couldn't put in a quarterly report." Her eyes were bright, tears or rain, he couldn't tell. "All those late nights working on the merger, all those conversations about nothing and everything, all those moments when you'd make me laugh about terrible coffee and impossible deadlines. You made me feel human again, Evan, and I didn't know how much I needed that until you were gone." Evan's hands were shaking now too. "Claire, you can't. We can't. There's a power dynamic. That's why I waited." She cut him off gently. "You're not my employee anymore. There's no HR violation, no ethical concern, no professional boundary being crossed. It's just you and me, and a choice." She paused. "Your choice." "My choice about what?" "About whether you want me to leave right now and never mention this again, or whether you want me to tell you the truth I've been holding back for 8 months. 8 months? That was specific. That was the exact amount of time since the night they'd worked until 3 a.m. on the merger proposal, since he'd brought her terrible coffee from the break room and she'd smiled at him like he'd handed her something precious. Evan knew he should tell her to leave, knew he should protect himself, protect his heart, protect whatever remained of his sanity after the worst week of his life. But he'd spent 3 years being smart and professional and appropriate, and where had it gotten him? Sitting alone in an apartment that smelled like failure and regret. "Tell me," he said. Claire's expression shifted, relief and terror in equal measure. "I'm in love with you," she said, and the words came out like confession, like surrender. "I've been in love with you since you brought me coffee at 3 in the morning and told me I needed to go home before I forgot what my apartment looked like. Since you argued with me about the Parker acquisition and were the only person in the building brave enough to tell me I was wrong. Since you sent me that email about work-life balance being a myth perpetuated by people who don't have lives outside work, and I realized you were describing both of us." Evan couldn't breathe. The room felt too small, too warm, too full of possibility and danger. "You don't know what you're saying," he managed. "You're Claire Harrington. You don't... People like you don't what? Don't fall in love, don't show up at apartments in the rain like some romantic comedy cliché?" She stepped closer, and he could see the vulnerability in her eyes, the fear. "I'm 34 years old, Evan. I've built a company worth $500 million. I've negotiated deals that would make your head spin, but I've never ever been more terrified than I am right now, standing in your apartment, hoping you don't tell me to leave." "Why would I tell you to leave?" "Because I'm intense. I'm difficult. I work too much and I forget to eat lunch, and I can be controlling and demanding and impossible." "Claire." He said her name like a prayer, like a promise. "Stop." She stopped, stood there dripping rainwater onto his floor, looking nothing like the powerful CEO who'd commanded his professional life for 3 years, and everything like the woman he'd fallen for somewhere between strategic planning sessions and midnight coffee runs. "I quit because I was drowning," Evan said quietly. "But not just because of the work." Her eyes widened. "Then why?" "Because every time I looked at you across a conference table, every time we stayed late working on some deal or merger, every time you smiled at something I said, I wanted things I had no right to want. And I couldn't keep doing it. Couldn't keep pretending I was just your operations director, that all those conversations were just about business." He ran a hand through his hair. "I was in love with my boss and it was killing me." The confession hung in the air between them. "Was?" Claire asked, her voice barely audible. "Am," Evan corrected. "Present tense. Turns out resignation letters don't cure that particular problem." Something shifted in her expression. Hope, maybe, or relief, or the same terrifying recognition that was currently tearing through Evan's carefully constructed defenses. "So what do we do now?" she asked. "I don't know." It was the most honest answer he'd given in months. "I quit my job 4 days ago because I was having a breakdown. You just showed up at my apartment and told me you're in love with me. This is insane." "Completely insane," she agreed. "We'll probably crash and burn. Most likely. It violates every principle of healthy decision-making." "Absolutely." "And you're still soaking wet." That surprised a laugh out of her, short and startled, the sound of someone who'd forgotten she was allowed to find things funny. "I am pretty wet." Evan grabbed a towel from the bathroom, handed it to her. She dried her face, her hair, creating a small pile of damp fabric that she set carefully on the arm of his couch. "I have a proposition," Claire said, and despite everything, despite the emotional chaos of the last 10 minutes, her voice took on that familiar note of controlled authority. "And before you say anything, I want you to know you can say no. You can tell me to leave right now, and Monday morning I'll send you a standard severance package, and we'll never speak of this again." But if you're willing to hear me out, I'd like to offer you something different than what we had before." Evan waited. Claire walked to the window, looked out at the rain-soaked street below. "I've been thinking about what you said in your resignation letter, about building someone else's dream, about forgetting what it feels like to want something." She turned back to face him. "What if we built something different? Not a return to how things were, but something new." "I'm listening." "Harrington Global needs an operations director. But more than that, it needs someone who understands that success isn't measured in quarterly earnings and market share. Someone who gets that people aren't resources to be optimized. They're humans who need balance and boundaries and lives outside the office." She paused. Someone who'd be brave enough to tell the CEO when she's pushing too hard, including pushing herself. "You're offering me my job back." "No." Claire's voice was firm. I'm offering you a different job. Chief Operating Officer reporting directly to the board, not to me. Autonomous decision-making power over company culture and employee wellness programs. The authority to implement real work-life balance initiatives, even if I argue about them. Especially if I argue about them. Evan stared at her. That's a promotion. It's a necessity. I've been running Harrington Global like it's a machine that needs maximum output. And you were right. That breaks people. It broke you. It's been breaking me for years, I just didn't see it. She moved closer. I need someone who won't let me turn the company into a burnout factory. Someone who will fight for the humans in the building, not just the bottom line. And you think that someone is me? The guy who just had a breakdown and quit via email? I think that someone is exactly you. Because you had the courage to walk away when it cost you everything. Because you chose yourself over a paycheck and a title. Because you're the only person I know who understands the difference between building a company and building a life. Claire's voice softened. And because I trust you, Evan, I trust you to tell me the truth even when it's hard to hear. The offer hung in the air between them, tempting and terrifying in equal measure. There's a problem, Evan said quietly. What problem? You just told me you're in love with me. I just told you I'm in love with you. And now you're offering me a job where I'd be working closely with you every day. That seems like a recipe for disaster. Claire nodded slowly. You're right, which is why we need to make a choice right now about what this is. I'm not following. We can't be colleagues and lovers simultaneously, not in a healthy way. So we choose. She met his eyes. Either you take the job and we remain strictly professional, friends maybe, if we can manage it, but nothing more. Or we explore whatever this is between us and you find work somewhere else. No middle ground, no trying to have both. It was such a Claire solution. Clean boundaries, clear expectations, no room for ambiguity, and it was completely impossible. You're asking me to choose between a career opportunity and a relationship that doesn't even exist yet? I'm asking you to choose what you need, Claire corrected, not what's practical or strategic or smart, what you actually need. Evan looked at her, really looked at her. She was still shivering slightly, still damp from the rain, still the most beautiful and infuriating woman he'd ever known. In 3 years of working together, he'd seen her confident, demanding, brilliant, ruthless. He'd never seen her vulnerable, never seen her risk anything that wasn't carefully calculated. Until tonight. What do you need? He asked. She smiled, sad and small. I need you to choose what's right for you, not what you think I want to hear. That's not an answer. No, she agreed. It's not. They stood in the wreckage of his apartment, the beer bottles and books and evidence of a breakdown that had led to this exact moment. And Evan felt something shift inside him. Some recognition that the choice wasn't actually between career and romance, between practical and emotional, between smart and reckless. The choice was between fear and courage. He'd spent 3 years being afraid of wanting too much, afraid of crossing lines, afraid of admitting that he'd fallen for a woman who seemed completely out of reach. And that fear had nearly destroyed him. I can't take that job, he said. Claire's expression didn't change, but he saw something flicker in her eyes. Okay. Not because I don't want it, not because I don't think I could do it, but because I've spent too long making decisions based on what's smart and safe and appropriate. He took a step closer. And right now, standing here with you, the smart thing would be to take the promotion and walk away from whatever this is between us. But I'm tired of smart, Claire. I'm tired of appropriate. What do you want? She whispered. I want to know what happens if we stop pretending, if we stop hiding behind professional distance and appropriate boundaries. I want to see if the woman I fell in love with during late-night work sessions is the same woman standing in my apartment right now. He paused. And I want you to have the same choice, to decide if you want this, want me, without any professional obligation or power dynamic or strategic advantage. Just you and me, figuring it out. Claire's breath caught. You're choosing me. I'm choosing us. If there is an us, if you still want there to be. She closed the distance between them in 2 steps, and then she was kissing him, fierce and desperate and nothing like he'd imagined during 3 years of carefully maintained professional distance. She tasted like rain and lipstick and possibility. and Evan kissed her back like he was drowning and she was air. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Claire rested her forehead against his. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "I don't know how to be in a relationship. I work 70-hour weeks. I'm terrible at communication. I'll probably try to schedule our dates in my calendar and optimize our time together for maximum efficiency." Evan laughed, the sound surprising him. "I just quit my job via email and spent 4 days drinking beer on my couch. I'm not exactly relationship material either. So we're both disasters. Completely. This is probably a terrible idea. The worst. But you're not walking away?" Evan looked at her, this brilliant, difficult, impossible woman who'd shown up at his door in the rain because she couldn't let him disappear from her life, who'd risked rejection and vulnerability and everything her controlled, careful world was built on, just to tell him the truth. "No," he said, "I'm not walking away." "Good." Claire kissed him again, softer this time. "Because I've already walked away from too many things that mattered. I'm not doing it again." They stood there in his apartment, the same apartment where he'd written a resignation letter 4 days ago, where he'd convinced himself that walking away was the only choice. And Evan felt something he hadn't felt in months. Hope. "So what happens now, he asked. Claire pulled back slightly, her hand still resting on his chest. "Now we figure it out. Together. No power dynamics, no professional obligations. Just two people who are apparently terrible at being alone, trying to see if they're any better at being together." "That sounds terrifying." "It is terrifying." She smiled and it transformed her face, made her look younger, lighter, like someone who'd just set down a weight she'd been carrying for years. "But I've spent a decade playing it safe, Evan. Building a company, maintaining control, never letting anyone close enough to matter. And you know what? I'm successful and miserable and completely alone." "You're not alone anymore." "No," she agreed, her eyes bright. "I'm not." Outside, the rain began to slow, the storm breaking into something gentler. Thunder rumbled in the distance, moving away toward the mountains. Evan's apartment still smelled like old takeout and stale air, but Claire was here, solid and real, and choosing him despite every practical reason not to. "Stay," he said. It wasn't really a question. Claire looked around the apartment, the mess, the chaos, the evidence of his breakdown. Then she looked back at him. "Okay. I mean, I don't have much. The couch is probably the most comfortable option, and there's not much food, and Evan," she pressed a finger to his lips, "stop trying to manage my expectations. I'm not here because your apartment is nice or because you have everything figured out. I'm here because I can't be anywhere else." He kissed her finger, then her palm, then pulled her close again. "We're really doing this. We're really doing this. It's going to be complicated. Everything worth having is complicated." They ended up on the couch, the same couch where Evan had spent 4 days spiraling, talking until nearly 3 in the morning. Claire told him about her marriage, about the slow dissolution of something that had never really been love, just convenience and expectation, about building Harrington Global from nothing, about the pride and the isolation, about forgetting somewhere along the way that companies were supposed to serve life, not consume it. Evan told her about his ex-girlfriend, about the breakup that had happened slowly and then all at once, about realizing too late that he'd been using work to avoid dealing with his actual life, about the panic attacks that started 6 months ago, about the insomnia and the weight loss, and all the warning signs he'd ignored until his body forced the issue by shutting down completely. They talked about the late nights at the office, about when exactly friendship had shifted into something else, about all the moments they'd both pretended not to notice. Claire admitted she'd nearly said something after the Parker acquisition closed, when they'd celebrated with champagne at midnight, and she'd caught herself imagining what might happen if she kissed him. Evan confessed that he'd drafted his resignation letter a dozen times before finally sending it, because staying was becoming unbearable, but leaving meant never seeing her again. "So when did you know?" Claire asked, her head resting on his shoulder, her hand tracing absent patterns on his arm. "When did you know you were in love with me?" Evan thought about it. "Remember the Thompson merger, when everything went sideways and we had to rebuild the entire proposal in 48 hours? "I remember. We basically lived in the office that week. It was 2 in the morning on the second night, You were absolutely furious at Thompson, at our legal team, at the universe in general, and you looked at me and said, I'm going to destroy Thompson's negotiating position so thoroughly his grandchildren will feel it. And I thought, oh no, I'm completely in love with this terrifying woman. Claire laughed, the sound warm against his chest. That's when you knew? When I was threatening corporate vengeance? You were magnificent. Terrifying, but magnificent. He kissed the top of her head. What about you? She was quiet for a moment. The coffee, she said finally. The coffee? You brought me terrible break room coffee at 3 a.m. and told me I needed to go home. And I got irrationally angry because how dare you tell me what I needed? But then you said, Claire, you've been in this office for 19 hours. The merger will still be here tomorrow. You won't be if you don't sleep. She shifted to look up at him. No one had said my name like that in years. Like I was a person, not a position. Like you actually cared if I burned out. I did care. I do care. I know. That's when I knew. She settled back against him. I went home that night and couldn't sleep because all I could think about was the way you'd looked at me, concerned and frustrated, and something else I didn't want to name. And I realized I was in serious trouble. Why didn't you say anything? For the same reason you didn't. Power dynamics, professional ethics, fear. She laced her fingers through his. Mostly fear. They fell asleep there on the couch, wrapped around each other like people who'd been doing this for years instead of hours, like they were something steady and sure instead of brand new and terrifying. When Evan woke up, early morning light was filtering through the windows, turning the rain-wet streets golden. Claire was still asleep, her face peaceful in a way he'd never seen during office hours. He carefully extracted himself, covered her with a blanket, and went to make coffee. His phone had 17 missed messages. Marcus asking if he was okay, his sister demanding updates, HR with paperwork questions. He ignored all of them and instead stood in the kitchen, watching coffee drip into the pot, trying to process the fact that Claire Harrington was asleep on his couch. That better be real coffee and not whatever terrible thing you served me at 3 a.m. 6 months ago. Evan turned to find Claire awake, blanket wrapped around her shoulders, hair a mess, makeup completely gone. She looked nothing like the CEO who commanded boardrooms, and everything like someone he could imagine waking up to every morning. It's the good stuff, he promised, pouring 2 cups. I saved the terrible coffee for special occasions. Define special occasions. Corporate vengeance, merger negotiations, late-night crisis management. She accepted the cup, took a sip, made a face. This is still pretty terrible. Yeah, well, I quit my job. Coffee budget took a hit. Claire set down her cup, suddenly serious. About that. About the job offer. I meant what I said last night. It's yours if you want it, even with us. This. She gestured between them. The board reports directly to them. You'd have complete autonomy. We could make it work professionally. But Claire. But I also meant what I said about choosing, about not trying to have both. So if you want to explore this, us, then we figure out the career stuff separately. No pressure, no obligations. Evan leaned against the counter, studying her. What do you want? I want you to be happy. I want you to heal from whatever broke in you that led to that resignation letter. I want... She stopped, started again. I want to be with you without guilt or complications or power dynamics. I want to see if we can be as good together in real life as we were in my head for 8 months. Even if it means I don't come back to Harrington Global? Even if, especially if. She moved closer. I spent 10 years building a company. I can spend some time building a relationship. It should have been a hard decision. Turning down a promotion, a significant raise, the chance to implement real change at a company he'd poured 3 years of his life into. But standing in his tiny kitchen with terrible coffee and morning light, and Claire wrapped in his blanket, it felt like the easiest choice he'd ever made. I need time, he said, to figure out who I am when I'm not drowning. To build something that's mine, not just a role in someone else's vision, to remember what I actually want from life. Claire nodded. How much time? I don't know, a few months at least, maybe longer. He set down his coffee. Is that okay? It's more than okay, it's healthy. She smiled. Look at us, making mature decisions about boundaries and personal growth. We're very evolved. Practically enlightened. They both laughed, and it felt good. Easy in a way nothing between them had ever been easy before. "So what does this look like?" Evan asked. "Us, I mean, if we're doing this." Claire considered. "I don't know. I've never dated someone I used to work with. Never dated anyone who actually knew me, really. My ex-husband thought he married a rising business star. He didn't realize he'd married someone obsessed with success to the exclusion of everything else." "You're more than success." "Am I?" "I'm not sure I know how to be." She looked vulnerable again, uncertain. "What if I'm terrible at this? What if I can't turn off the CEO part of my brain? What if I try to schedule intimacy and optimize our relationship for maximum efficiency?" "Then I'll call you on it," Evan said simply. "The same way I called you on pushing too hard at work. The same way you called me on using deadlines to avoid dealing with my actual problems." He pulled her close. "We figure it out together, messily, imperfectly, without trying to control every variable." "I'm not good at mess." "I know, but maybe that's why we work. You need someone who's okay with chaos. I need someone who believes in building towards something." Claire rested her head against his chest. "This is terrifying." "Yeah, we could fail spectacularly. Probably will, honestly. But we're doing it anyway. We're doing it anyway." They stood there in the kitchen while the coffee got cold and the morning light grew stronger. Two people who'd spent years building walls finally brave enough to tear them down. And somewhere in the wreckage of Evan's resignation and Claire's confession, in the space between what they'd been and what they might become, something new began to grow, tentative and fragile and absolutely worth the risk. The first real date happened 3 weeks later, after Evan had cleaned his apartment, started therapy, and stopped checking his work email every 15 minutes out of habit. Claire picked him up on a Tuesday evening in a car that cost more than he'd made in his first year at Harrington Global. But she was wearing jeans again and her hair was down, and somehow that mattered more than the luxury vehicle. "Where are we going?" Evan asked, settling into leather seats that probably cost more than his couch. "Somewhere terrible," Claire said, pulling into traffic with the kind of aggressive confidence she brought to everything. "I asked Marcus what you like to do for fun. He said you used to talk about this dive bar in Fremont that had terrible bands and good wings." Evan stared at her. "You asked Marcus about me?" "I'm gathering intelligence. It's what I do." She glanced at him, suddenly uncertain. "Is that weird?" "That's weird, isn't it?" "I'm being weird." "It's kind of weird," he admitted, "but also kind of perfect." The bar was exactly as terrible as Evan remembered. Sticky floors, off-key karaoke, wings that were somehow both burnt and undercooked. Claire looked completely out of place in her expensive jeans and cashmere sweater, but she ordered a beer without hesitation and didn't even flinch when the bartender served it in a plastic cup. "This is awful," she said, taking a sip. "I know. Isn't it great?" "I genuinely can't tell if you're being ironic." Evan laughed, the sound surprising him with its ease. 6 months ago, I would have taken you somewhere nice. Somewhere that matched the image of what dating a CEO should look like. But I'm trying this new thing where I don't perform for people anymore." Claire set down her beer, studied him seriously. "And what does not performing look like?" "This. Terrible bars and honest conversation, admitting that I have no idea what I'm doing with my life right now. Letting you see the parts of me that aren't strategic or impressive." "I like those parts," Claire said quietly. "I think I like them best." They stayed for 3 hours, talking over music that hurt their ears and wings that progressively got worse with each order. Claire told him about growing up in Boston, about parents who'd expected her to be a lawyer or a doctor, about choosing business school instead, and having to prove herself twice as hard because she deviated from the plan. About building Harrington Global in a male-dominated industry, about the loneliness of being the youngest woman CEO in her sector. Evan told her about his family, about parents who were still together but had forgotten why, about a sister who worried too much, about choosing operations management because it felt safe and structured when his actual dreams had been messier and less defined. "What did you want to be?" Claire asked. "Before you chose safe," Evan hesitated, then figured honesty was the point. A writer, maybe a journalist, something that involved telling stories, making sense of chaos. But that felt impractical, so I got my MBA instead and convinced myself that operations was close enough. Is it close enough? No, he admitted. It turns out optimizing supply chains is nothing like telling stories that matter. Claire was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the sticky table. I wanted to be an architect, she said finally. I loved the idea of building things that would last, that would shape how people lived and moved through space. But architecture felt too uncertain, too dependent on vision and inspiration. Business was something I could control. Do you ever regret it? Every day, she said, then laughed at his expression. Not the company. I'm proud of what I've built. But sometimes I walk past buildings downtown and wonder what I could have created if I'd been braver. If I'd trusted that the uncertain path might lead somewhere worth going. A drunk couple stumbled past their table, singing off-key to a song that hadn't been popular since 2005. The bartender yelled something about last call, even though it was only 10 p.m. Claire's phone buzzed with what was probably an urgent business matter, and she didn't even glance at it. Thank you, Evan said. For what? For being here. For not checking your phone. For admitting you wanted to be an architect. He reached across the table, took her hand. For being just as much of a mess as I am. Claire's fingers tightened around his. I'm not a mess. I'm strategically challenged in the area of personal relationships. That's just a fancy way of saying mess. Fine. I'm a mess. She smiled, and it was the real smile. The one that transformed her face, made her look younger and lighter and absolutely beautiful. But I'm your mess now, I guess. They left when the bar actually did close, walking to the car through streets that smelled like rain and possibility. Claire drove him home but didn't leave, following him up the stairs to his apartment that was cleaner now, but still basically the same collection of IKEA furniture and abandoned ambition. Can I ask you something? Claire said, standing in his living room like she was trying to memorize the space. Anything. Are you happy? Right now, in this moment, are you happy? Evan thought about it. 3 weeks ago, he'd been drowning in depression and unemployment. Now he was standing in his apartment with a woman who terrified and fascinated him in equal measure, with no job and no plan and no certainty about anything except that he wanted to keep seeing where this led. Yeah, he said. I think I am. Claire kissed him then, soft and searching, like she was asking a question only their bodies could answer. They ended up on his bed, the same bed where he'd spent countless sleepless nights worrying about quarterly reports and merger deadlines. And everything that happened next was slow and deliberate and nothing like the efficient, optimized version of intimacy Evan had gotten used to in his previous relationship. Afterwards, lying tangled in sheets that probably needed washing, Claire traced the scar on his shoulder from a cycling accident years ago. Tell me something true, she said. Something you've never told anyone. Evan considered lying, making something up that would sound impressive or deep. But that was the old version of himself, the one who performed instead of being. I'm scared, he admitted. I'm 30 years old with no job and no plan, and I just started something with a woman who's probably going to realize I'm not worth the trouble. And I'm terrified that this feeling, this happiness, is temporary. That I'm going to wake up one day and realize I've made a huge mistake. Claire was quiet for so long that Evan thought maybe he'd said too much, been too honest, revealed too much of the fear that lived under his skin. Then she said, I fired someone last week for incompetence. She'd been with the company for 8 years, had 3 kids, was a month away from retirement, and I did it without hesitation because it was the strategic choice, the thing that served the company's interests. She turned to look at him. That's who I am, Evan. Someone who can ruin a person's life and sleep fine afterwards. Someone who's optimized empathy out of her decision-making process. That's not all you are, isn't it? I've spent 10 years becoming exactly this person. Efficient, ruthless, focused entirely on outcomes. What if that's all that's left? What if the woman you think you're falling for doesn't actually exist? Evan rolled onto his side, facing her fully. The woman I'm falling for showed up at my door in the rain because she couldn't let me disappear. She orders terrible beer in dive bars and admits she wanted to be an architect. She's lying in my bed right now, being honest about her fears instead of pretending everything's fine. He paused. That woman exists, Claire. I know, because I'm looking at her. Tears gathered in Claire's eyes, actual tears from a woman who probably hadn't cried in a boardroom in her entire life. I don't know how to do this. How to be vulnerable and powerful at the same time. How to run a company and have a relationship. How to be enough for you while still being who I need to be professionally. Then we figure it out together, Evan said simply. Messily. Without a strategic plan or optimization metrics. We just try. I'm not good at trying without a plan. I know, but maybe that's the point. Maybe we both need to learn how to build something without knowing exactly what it's going to look like. They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, two people who'd spent years being alone, finally brave enough to be together. And when Evan woke up in the morning, Claire was still there. No early departure for meetings, no strategic retreat to maintain distance. Just her, sleep soft and human, breathing steady against his chest. The weeks that followed developed a rhythm that felt nothing like the careful structure of their working relationship. Claire would show up at his apartment after brutal days at the office, still wearing her corporate armor, and Evan would make her laugh until she remembered how. He started writing again. Not anything serious, just observations and stories, fragments of the life he'd put on hold. Claire read everything, offering feedback that was sometimes too honest but always came from a place of genuine interest. This part about your sister's wedding, it's good, but you're holding back, she said one evening, red pen in hand, marking up his pages like they were merger documents. You describe what happened, but not how you felt about it. I felt fine about it. Liar. She looked at him over the pages. You describe your mother crying and your father looking uncomfortable and your sister glowing with happiness, but you don't say what any of that meant to you. Why you were there alone. Why watching people commit to each other made you feel like you were doing something wrong with your own life. Evan took the pages back. How do you know that's what I was feeling? Because I read between the lines. And because I know what it's like to watch other people build lives while you build a career instead. She set down the pen. Write the truth, Evan, not the version that makes you look good. So he did. He wrote about feeling like a fraud at his sister's wedding, about watching her marry someone she'd known for 18 months while he couldn't make a relationship last past the 6-month mark, about his mother's gentle questions about when he'd settle down, about his father's pride in his corporate success that felt hollow because it wasn't what he actually wanted, about standing in the back of the church and wondering if this was all there was. Work and loneliness and occasional appearances at other people's celebrations. Claire read it and cried, which was becoming less shocking but still felt significant. That's it, she said. That's the truth. It's painful and beautiful and completely honest. It's depressing. It's human. She pulled him close. Keep writing like that, like you're not afraid of being seen. But the truth was, Evan was afraid. Because the more time he spent with Claire, the more he realized how much he'd invested in something that still felt impossibly fragile. They'd been together 2 months, and already he couldn't imagine going back to the careful loneliness of his old life, which meant she had the power to destroy him completely. He should have known it couldn't last without complications. The first crack appeared on a Thursday evening when Claire showed up 90 minutes late for dinner, still on her phone, barely apologizing before diving back into whatever crisis had consumed her day. Evan had actually cooked, not just ordered takeout, and the pasta was cold by the time she sat down. Sorry, she said, not sounding sorry at all. The Patterson deal is falling apart, and I had to personally call 3 board members to keep everyone calm. It's fine, Evan said, reheating the food. You're upset. I said it's fine. Claire set down her phone, gave him her full attention for the first time since arriving. You're doing that thing where you say you're fine, but your voice gets very calm and controlled, which means you're actually furious. I'm not furious, I'm just... He stopped, tried again. We made plans. I cooked, and you were late and distracted and still on your phone, and it feels like I'm back to being the thing you fit in between meetings. That's not fair. I have a company to run. You know that. I do know that, but I also thought we agreed that this, us, was important enough to actually prioritize. Claire's expression hardened in a way Evan recognized from conference rooms and difficult negotiations. So what? I'm supposed to let deals fall apart because we have dinner plans? I'm supposed to risk millions of dollars and dozens of jobs because you cooked pasta? That's not what I'm saying. Then what are you saying? Evan set down the pan he'd been holding, faced her fully. I'm saying that if every crisis is going to take priority over us, then we're not actually building a relationship. We're just scheduling intimacy around your work demands. My work demands keep me employed. They keep me relevant. They're what made me the person you supposedly fell in love with. I fell in love with the woman who showed up at my door in the rain, not the CEO who can't put down her phone for 90 minutes. The words landed hard, creating distance between them that felt vast and unbridgeable. Claire stood abruptly, grabbed her purse. Maybe this was a mistake, she said, voice cold. Maybe we were better as colleagues than whatever this is supposed to be. Claire, I should go. I have early meetings tomorrow anyway. She left before Evan could figure out how to fix it, the door closing with a finality that echoed through his apartment. He stood there surrounded by cold pasta and the wreckage of their first real fight, wondering if this was how it ended. Not with dramatic declarations, but with scheduling conflicts and incompatible priorities. 3 days passed without contact. Evan wrote and deleted 17 text messages, each one sounding either too desperate or too casual. His therapist, a woman in her 50s who'd seen enough burned-out professionals to fill a stadium, listened to his description of the fight and asked what he was actually afraid of. That she was right, Evan admitted, that this was a mistake, that we're too different to make it work. Or, Dr. Chen prompted, or that I'm too damaged to be in a relationship with someone that intense, that I'll always feel like I'm competing with her company for attention. Are those the only options? Evan thought about it. No. The third option is that we're both terrible at this and need to figure out how to communicate without destroying each other in the process. That sounds more accurate. Dr. Chen smiled. Relationships require practice, Evan, especially when both people are recovering from years of prioritizing everything except their emotional health. The text from Claire came on Sunday afternoon. Can we talk? Not at your place or mine, somewhere neutral. They met at a coffee shop in Capitol Hill, the kind of place that took coffee so seriously it felt vaguely threatening. Claire looked tired, like she hadn't been sleeping, and Evan probably looked the same. I was wrong, she said before he could speak. About Thursday. About saying this was a mistake. I was angry and scared, and I said something I didn't mean to hurt you. I was wrong too, Evan replied. I made you choose between me and your company, which isn't fair. I know who you are, knew it from the beginning. But you weren't wrong about the priority issue. Claire wrapped her hands around her coffee cup like she needed something to hold on to. I've spent 10 years making work the center of everything, and part of me is terrified that if I stop doing that, I'll lose the thing that defines me. The company doesn't define you, doesn't it? When people think of Claire Harrington, they think of Harrington Global. They think of the woman who built a $500 million company before 35. Take that away and what's left? Evan reached across the table, took her hand. The woman who wanted to be an architect, who shows up in the rain, who cries over honest writing and orders terrible beer. The woman who's brave enough to be vulnerable with someone who's just as scared as she is. Claire's eyes filled with tears. I don't know how to be that woman, and the CEO at the same time. Then maybe you don't have to be both all the time. Maybe you can be the CEO at work and just Claire with me. Just Claire, she repeated like the concept was foreign. I'm not sure I know who that is. Then we figure it out together. But Claire, he waited until she met his eyes. I need you to actually choose this sometimes. Not just when it's convenient, not just when there's no crisis demanding your attention. I need to know that I matter enough to occasionally take priority. She nodded slowly. You're right, and I'm sorry. When the Patterson deal started falling apart, I reverted to default mode. Work is everything. Everything else can wait. I didn't even think about how that would make you feel. It made me feel like I was back to being your operations director. Someone useful, but ultimately expendable. You're not expendable. She stopped, started again. You're the only person in my life who sees me as something other than a function. Who wants to know about the architecture I never designed and the dreams I deferred? Who makes me feel like I'm allowed to be human instead of perfect? They sat there while expensive coffee got cold and the Sunday afternoon crowd filtered in and out, just holding hands across a table like it was the most important negotiation either of them had ever conducted. "I have an idea," Claire said finally. "I don't know if it'll work, but I want to try. I'm listening. Tuesday and Thursday evenings are yours. No meetings, no calls, no work emergencies unless someone is literally dying or the company is literally burning down. Those nights, I'm not the CEO. I'm just Claire, figuring out how to be in a relationship." She paused. "And in exchange, I need you to understand that the other nights I might be consumed by work. That building a company requires intensity that doesn't fit neatly into business hours. That's a very CEO solution to a relationship problem." "I know, but it's the best I can offer right now. Structure helps me manage competing priorities." Evan considered it. Part of him wanted to argue that love shouldn't need scheduling, that real relationships were spontaneous and all-consuming, but that was romantic fantasy, not reality. And the reality was that Claire ran a major company, and he was trying to rebuild a life, and maybe structured time together was better than constant conflict about availability. "Okay," he said, "Tuesday and Thursday evenings, plus we check in every morning, even if it's just a text. So I know you're thinking about me even on the days we don't see each other." Claire smiled, genuine and relieved. "Deal, but I get to set one condition too." "What condition?" "You keep writing. Not just as a hobby, but seriously. I want to see you build something that's yours, not just recover from what broke." She squeezed his hand. "I fell in love with someone who wanted more than just survival. I want to see you actually pursue that." It was terrifying and exactly what Evan needed to hear. "Okay, I'll keep writing. Promise?" "Promise." They left the coffee shop hand in hand, walking through Capitol Hill like two people who'd just navigated their first major crisis without completely destroying each other. It wasn't perfect. The schedule felt artificial. The compromise felt like settling. But it was honest. And maybe honesty was more important than perfection. That night, Claire came over for what wasn't technically her scheduled evening, and they ordered takeout and watched terrible reality television and didn't talk about work or writing or any of the heavy things that had consumed them for days. They just existed together, and it was enough. Later, lying in bed with Claire's head on his chest, Evan said, "I'm still scared." "Of what?" "That this won't be enough. That eventually you'll choose the company over me. That I'll resent you for being more successful, more driven, more everything." Claire was quiet for a long moment. "I'm scared too. That I'll fail at this the way I failed at every other relationship. That you'll realize I'm too difficult, too intense, too married to my work. That I'll wake up one day and you'll be gone because I couldn't figure out how to balance everything." So we're both terrified. Completely. She turned to look at him. "But we're doing it anyway." "Yeah," Evan agreed. "We're doing it anyway." And somehow, in the admission of fear, in the honesty about their limitations and insecurities, they found something stronger than certainty. They found commitment, not to perfection, but to trying, to showing up even when it was hard, to communicating even when it hurt, to building something together even when they had no idea if it would work. It wasn't the romance of movies or novels. It was messier, harder, more complicated, but it was real. And for two people who'd spent years hiding behind professional masks and strategic distance, real was revolutionary. The Tuesday-Thursday arrangement lasted 6 weeks before it fell apart spectacularly. Not because either of them stopped trying, but because Claire's company launched an acquisition that required her attention 7 days a week for 3 weeks straight, and Evan's writing finally started getting traction when a literary magazine accepted one of his essays about corporate burnout. They were both succeeding, just not at being together. "I can't do this," Claire said on what should have been a Thursday evening, but was actually her 5th consecutive night at the office. She'd called Evan at midnight, voice raw with exhaustion. "I'm trying to close the biggest deal of my career and I feel guilty every second I'm not with you. And when I am with you, I'm thinking about the 20 fires I'm not putting out. I'm failing at everything." Evan sat up in bed, wide awake now. "You're not failing." "I missed Tuesday completely. I forgot to text you yesterday morning. I can't remember the last time we had an actual conversation that wasn't me apologizing for being unavailable." She sounded close to tears. "Maybe we were wrong about this. Maybe we can't make it work." Don't say that. Why not? It's true, isn't it? I'm who I've always been, someone who can't balance a relationship and a career, and you deserve someone who can actually show up. Evan got out of bed, started pacing his apartment. Outside, Seattle sparkled with late-night lights, all those people living their lives while his threatened to come apart again. Where are you right now? My office, where I've been for the last 16 hours. I'm coming there. Evan, it's midnight. I know what time it is. I'm coming there anyway. He hung up before she could argue, threw on clothes, and called a car. 20 minutes later, he was walking into Harrington Global for the first time since his resignation, past security, who looked confused but let him through when he mentioned Claire's name, up to the executive floor that had been his second home for 3 years. Claire's office door was open, light spilling into the hallway. She sat at her desk, buried in papers and laptop screens, still wearing the suit she'd probably put on yesterday morning, hair falling out of its bun, looking like every stressed executive in every cautionary tale about work-life balance. "You came," she said, looking up as he entered. "Of course I came." Evan closed the door behind him, surveyed the chaos. "When did you last eat something that wasn't coffee?" "I don't know. Tuesday?" "It's Thursday. Well, Friday now." He pulled out his phone, ordered food from the only place still delivering at this hour. Then he sat in the chair across from her desk, the same chair where he'd sat through countless meetings, back when their relationship was simple and clear and completely professional. "You shouldn't be here," Claire said, but she didn't sound convinced. "Probably not. But here's the thing I realized on the drive over. We've been approaching this wrong." "What do you mean?" "The schedule, the boundaries, the trying to separate CEO Claire from regular Claire. It doesn't work because you're not two different people. You're one person who's trying to do everything perfectly and destroying herself in the process." He leaned forward. "So what if we stopped trying to compartmentalize? What if we just figured out how to exist in each other's actual lives instead of creating artificial spaces where we pretend the rest doesn't exist?" Claire stared at him. "You want to integrate instead of separate." "Exactly. I can't keep pretending your company doesn't matter to you. And you can't keep trying to be a different person on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, so we find a different way." "What way?" "I don't know yet. But maybe it starts with me being here right now while you close this deal. Not trying to pull you away from it, just being present while you do what you need to do." The food arrived, terrible Chinese food that was somehow exactly what Claire needed. She ate while reviewing contracts, and Evan read on his phone, and they existed in the same space without demanding anything from each other except presence. It felt strange and perfect, and nothing like the romance novels suggested relationships should work. Around 2 a.m., Claire finally closed her laptop and looked at him with exhausted gratitude. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for letting me." Evan stood, offered his hand. "Come on, you need sleep." "I can't leave. I have a 7 a.m. call with the acquisition team." "Then we sleep here. You have a couch in your office that's nicer than my bed." They did exactly that. Collapsed on her office couch like college students pulling an all-nighter, Claire's head on his chest, both of them too tired for anything except the comfort of not being alone. When her alarm went off 4 hours later, Evan woke to find her already up, reviewing notes for her call. But she'd covered him with her suit jacket and left a note on the coffee table. "Thank you for understanding. I'll make it up to you." He left before her meeting started, catching an early car back to his apartment, and thought about what understanding actually meant. Not accepting neglect or second-place status, but recognizing that love wasn't about equal time distribution or scheduled intimacy. It was about showing up in the ways that mattered, even when, especially when, it was inconvenient. That weekend, when the acquisition finally closed and Claire had 48 hours to recover before the next crisis, she showed up at his door with a proposal. "Move in with me," she said, no preamble, just direct and immediate, like she approached everything that mattered. Evan, who'd been making coffee in pajama pants, nearly dropped the pot. "What?" "Move in with me. We're doing this backwards anyway, trying to maintain separate lives while building a relationship. It's not working, so let's just stop pretending we're casual about this." She walked past him into the apartment, the same way she'd walked in that rainy night months ago. "I have a house in Queen Anne with 3 bedrooms and an office you could use for writing. You're spending half your time at my place anyway when I'm not drowning in work. Just make it official." Claire, we've been together 3 months. I know, it's fast. It's probably too fast. But I'm tired of half measures and scheduled intimacy and pretending we can do this without actually committing. She turned to face him. I want to wake up with you every morning. I want to come home to you instead of an empty house. I want to build something real, not whatever compromise we've been attempting. Evan set down the coffee pot, trying to process. This feels like a reaction to the stress of the acquisition. It's not. I've been thinking about it for weeks. The acquisition just made it clear that the current arrangement isn't sustainable. She moved closer. I love you, Evan. I know we haven't said it explicitly yet, but I do. And I'm tired of being scared of that. Tired of holding back because it might not work out, or because it's too soon, or because conventional wisdom says we should wait. I love you too, Evan said, the words feeling both huge and simple. But moving in together, that's a big step. I know, and if you're not ready, I'll wait. But I wanted you to know that I'm ready, that I'm all in on this, whatever this becomes. Evan thought about his apartment, 300 square feet of IKEA furniture and lingering depression, a space he'd never really made into a home because he'd been too busy drowning to care about throw pillows or artwork. Then he thought about Claire's house, the place he'd been to a handful of times with its high ceilings and natural light and room for all the life he'd put on hold. I need to think about it, he said honestly, not because I don't want to, but because I want to make sure I'm saying yes for the right reasons. Claire nodded, accepting. Take whatever time you need. The offer stands. She left for a meeting, and Evan spent the day walking around Seattle thinking about what moving in together would mean. It would mean comfort and convenience, certainly. But it would also mean losing the independence he'd fought so hard to reclaim. It would mean being constantly available to someone whose life operated at intensity levels that had already burned him out once. His therapist, when he brought it up in their next session, asked him what he was actually afraid of. That I'll disappear again, Evan admitted. That I'll move into her house and her life and somehow stop being myself. That I'll become an accessory to Claire Harrington's success story instead of building my own story. And what makes you think that would happen? Because it's what happened at work. I got so absorbed in making her vision successful that I forgot I was supposed to have my own vision. Dr. Chen nodded thoughtfully. So the question isn't whether you move in with her. It's whether you can maintain your own identity while being in a relationship with someone that intense. Can I? I don't know. Can you? Evan thought about it. About the writing he'd started doing again. About the essay that got accepted. About the tentative sense of self he'd been rebuilding in the months since his resignation. Moving in with Claire didn't have to mean abandoning that. It could mean having a partner who supported it, who wanted to see him succeed at something that was his. But it could also mean exactly what he feared, getting swallowed by her bigger, brighter life. He gave her his answer on a Thursday evening, showing up at her house with a duffel bag and a conditions list he'd written out in careful detail. Yes, he said when she opened the door. But with terms. Claire smiled, amused and intrigued. Of course you have terms. Come in. They sat at her kitchen table. A massive thing made of reclaimed wood that probably cost more than Evan's car, and he presented his list. First, I need space that's mine. An office where I write, where work talk is off limits unless I invite it. Second, I need you to respect when I'm working, the same way I respect when you are. Third, we have actual date nights, not scheduled intimacy, but time where we're both present and focused on each other. And fourth, he paused, the most important one. If I start disappearing again, if you see me losing myself in supporting your life instead of building my own, you have to tell me. Because I can't go back to being that person who forgot how to want things. Claire read through the list carefully, the way she probably reviewed contracts. Then she looked up at him with complete seriousness. I accept all of those, but I have one condition of my own. What's that? If I get too absorbed in work, if I start treating you like a convenience instead of a partner, you have to call me on it. The same way you did when you quit. I need you to be honest, especially when it's hard to hear. Deal. Evan extended his hand for a formal shake, and Claire laughed, pulling him into a kiss instead. Moving in was chaos. Evan's possessions barely filled one room of Claire's house, making the disparity in their lives embarrassingly obvious. But Claire made space for him anyway, cleared out the third bedroom for his office, bought him a desk that was somehow exactly what he would have chosen, gave him a key and alarm code, and complete freedom to come and go as he pleased. "This is your home now," she said, watching him unpack books. "Not my home that you're visiting, ours." It took weeks for Evan to actually believe that. He kept waiting for Claire to establish rules or boundaries, to reveal that there were hidden expectations about how he should behave in her space. But she never did. When he left dishes in the sink, she washed them without comment. When he stayed up late writing and fell asleep on the office couch, she covered him with a blanket and let him work. When he needed silence and solitude, she gave him that without making it about her. And slowly, the house that had been Claire's became theirs. The first real test came 2 months after he moved in, when Evan's essay about corporate burnout went viral. It was picked up by a major business publication, shared thousands of times, generated heated debates in comment sections about work culture and employee wellness, and it mentioned Harrington Global by name. "I can't believe you published this without telling me," Claire said, laptop open to the essay, her expression unreadable. Evan's stomach dropped. He'd been so focused on the writing, on telling his truth, that he hadn't considered how Claire would feel seeing her company criticized publicly. "I didn't think. You wrote about the 80-hour weeks, the impossible deadlines, the culture that rewarded burnout and punished boundaries." She looked up at him. "You made Harrington Global sound like a place that destroys people." That was my experience." "I know. And reading it," her voice cracked slightly, "reading it made me realize how much damage I've done. Not just to you, but to everyone who's worked for me. I built exactly what you described, a machine that grinds people down." Evan sat beside her, read over her shoulder. The essay was honest, maybe brutally so. He'd written about the panic attacks and insomnia, about the slow erosion of his sense of self, about the moment he'd realized that staying would kill him. But he'd also been careful not to blame Claire personally, to frame it as a systemic issue rather than individual cruelty. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I should have warned you before it published, given you a chance to prepare for the response." "No." Claire closed the laptop. "You were right to publish it, and you were right not to run it by me first. It's your story, not mine." She paused. "But it's also true. Everything you wrote about the culture, about the expectations, it's all true. And I need to fix it." "Claire, I mean it. I'm calling an emergency board meeting. We're going to overhaul our entire approach to employee wellness, implement real work-life balance policies, create accountability for managers who push people too hard." She stood, already shifting into CEO mode. "Your essay is going to be required reading for every executive at Harrington Global." Evan watched her pace, saw the determination in her eyes, and realized something important. Claire wasn't defensive about the criticism. She was energized by it. This was who she was at her best, someone who saw problems and immediately started solving them, who turned criticism into action. "You're not angry," he said. "I'm furious, but not at you, at myself, for being so focused on growth and success that I didn't see the human cost, for becoming exactly the kind of leader I swore I'd never be." But she stopped pacing, looked at him directly. "Thank you for writing it, for telling the truth even though it was uncomfortable. I needed to hear it." The essay's publication changed things at Harrington Global. Claire implemented sweeping reforms, mandatory vacation policies, caps on weekly hours, wellness programs that actually had teeth. Some executives quit, unwilling to adapt to the new culture. But productivity went up, not down. Employee satisfaction improved dramatically, and within 6 months, Harrington Global was being featured in business magazines as a model for sustainable high-performance culture. "You know what's funny?" Claire said one evening, reading through the latest profile of her company's transformation. "I spent 10 years building one version of success, and it took your breakdown and brutal honesty to show me what success should actually look like." Which is? People who can sustain excellence because they're supported, not people who burn bright and fast until they collapse. She set aside the magazine. "I wish I'd figured that out before you had to quit to save yourself." "If you'd figured it out earlier, we wouldn't be here," Evan pointed out. "I wouldn't have quit. You wouldn't have shown up at my door in the rain. We'd still be maintaining professional distance and pretending we weren't in love. True, but I still hate that it took you breaking to wake me up. Evan pulled her close. Then make it worth something. Keep changing things. Keep being the leader who learns from mistakes instead of defending them. I'm trying. She rested her head on his shoulder. It's harder than I expected. Some days I want to fall back into old patterns, push harder, demand more, measure everything by output. But then I remember reading your essay, realizing I'd created the environment that almost destroyed you, and I find the will to do better. They sat there on the couch in what was now their house, both of them building something different than what they'd imagined. Claire was learning to be a leader who valued people over profit. Evan was learning to be a writer who told uncomfortable truths. And together, they were learning to be partners who supported each other's growth instead of competing for space. But growth was messy. 3 months after the essay's publication, Evan got an offer from a major publisher. They wanted him to write a book about corporate culture and burnout, to expand on the themes from his viral piece. It was everything he'd wanted when he dreamed about being a writer, before he'd convinced himself to pursue the safe path of business school and operations management. It was also terrifying. You have to do it, Claire said immediately when he told her. I don't know if I can. A whole book? I've barely managed to write 15 essays. What if I can't sustain it? What if I run out of things to say? Then you figure it out. But Evan, this is your chance. This is the thing you chose yourself over corporate success to pursue. You can't walk away from it because you're scared, says the woman who walked away from architecture to build a safer business. Claire flinched, the comparison hitting home. You're right. I did exactly that, and I've spent 10 years wondering what I could have created if I'd been braver. Don't make the same mistake. What if I fail? Then you fail. But at least you'll fail at something that matters to you, not at maintaining someone else's vision of your life. She took his hands. I'll support you however you need. If you need quiet to write, I'll be quiet. If you need to talk through ideas, I'll listen. If you need space or encouragement or someone to tell you when you're spiraling, I'm here. But you have to say yes to this. Evan signed the book contract a week later, hands shaking as he put his name on the line that would commit him to delivering a manuscript in 18 months. The advance was enough to live on, which meant he could write full-time without financial panic. It also meant he had no excuses left. The writing was brutal. Some days words flowed easily, and he'd fill pages with observations and stories and analysis. Other days he'd stare at blank screens for hours, convinced he was a fraud who'd gotten lucky with one essay and had nothing else to say. Claire learned to read his moods, to know when he needed encouragement and when he needed to be left alone to work through the difficulty himself. I don't know how you do it, Evan said one particularly frustrating afternoon. Run a company, make impossible decisions, keep showing up even when it's hard. The same way you write, Claire replied. One word at a time, one decision at a time. Trusting that the work matters even when it feels impossible. They developed rhythms that honored both their needs. Claire still worked long hours, but she was better about protecting evenings and weekends. Evan wrote obsessively but made sure to emerge from his office for meals and conversation. They fought sometimes about Claire's tendency to try solving his writing problems like they were business challenges, about Evan's occasional resentment when her work demanded attention during times he needed her. But they fought honestly, without the defensive walls that had characterized their first conflicts. We're getting better at this, Evan observed one Sunday morning, both of them reading in comfortable silence, Claire reviewing board materials, Evan editing chapters. At what? Being together without losing ourselves, supporting each other without trying to fix everything, just existing in the same space. He looked up from his laptop. I spent so long thinking relationships had to be all-consuming or not worth it, but this ordinary Sunday morning thing feels more real than any grand romantic gesture. Claire smiled, the expression soft and private. I know what you mean. I used to think success meant constant intensity, dramatic achievements, proving myself over and over. But sitting here with you, both of us working on things we care about, not performing for anyone, this feels like a different kind of success. What kind? The sustainable kind. The kind that doesn't burn us out or turn us into people we don't recognize. She set aside her papers. I'm happy, Evan. Actually, genuinely happy in a way I haven't been in years. Maybe ever. Me too, he admitted, and it was true. The happiness wasn't the euphoric, intense kind portrayed in movies. It was quieter, steadier, the satisfaction of building something that felt authentic instead of impressive. But authenticity required honesty, even when honesty was uncomfortable. 6 months into writing the book, Evan realized he needed to include a chapter about Claire, about their relationship, about how falling in love with his boss had complicated his understanding of workplace dynamics and power structures, about how her transformation as a leader had been partly motivated by their relationship, which raised questions about whether personal connection should be required to generate corporate empathy. "I need your permission," he said, showing her the draft chapter. Claire read it carefully, her expression neutral in the way that meant she was processing something difficult. When she finished, she set the pages down and was quiet for a long moment. "It's good," she said finally. "Honest and complex and uncomfortable in all the right ways. But it reveals things about us that are private, about how we got together, about my motivations for changing company culture. People will make assumptions." "I know. That's why I need your permission. If you're not comfortable with me publishing this, I'll write a different chapter." Claire stood, walked to the window overlooking their backyard. Evening light slanted through the trees, creating patterns on the floor that shifted with the breeze. "What do you want to do?" "I want to publish it. I think it's important. This idea that humanizing leaders sometimes requires them to have human relationships, to see the people they employ as more than resources. But I won't do it if it hurts you or the company." "You're asking me to choose between privacy and impact. I'm asking you to choose what you're comfortable with. This is your life too. Your story, even if I'm the one telling it." She turned back to face him, and Evan saw the conflict in her eyes. The private person who valued control warring with the leader who wanted to model vulnerability and growth. "Publish it," she said, "all of it. The uncomfortable parts, the questions about motivation, the reality that I needed to fall in love to remember that employees are human. It's true, even if it's not flattering." "Are you sure?" "No, but I'm learning that the most important decisions are usually the ones I'm least sure about." She returned to the couch, took his hand. "We've built something real, Evan. Something that changed both of us. Other people deserve to see what that looks like. Not the sanitized version, but the messy, complicated reality." The book, when it finally published 18 months after he'd signed the contract, was successful beyond Evan's wildest expectations. It spent 12 weeks on bestseller lists, generated national conversations about work culture and burnout, and established Evan as a voice in discussions about corporate responsibility and employee wellness. He did interviews and speaking engagements, appeared on podcasts and panels, became the thing he'd never imagined being, someone whose writing actually mattered to people beyond himself. And through all of it, Claire was there, not managing his career or trying to optimize his success, but supporting him in the ways that mattered, reminding him to eat before interviews, reading drafts when he spiraled into self-doubt, celebrating victories and weathering criticism beside him. "I'm proud of you," she said after a particularly difficult interview where he'd been challenged about his portrayal of corporate culture. "You don't think I was too harsh?" "I think you were honest, and honesty makes people uncomfortable, especially when it challenges systems they benefit from." She pulled him close. "But discomfort is how change happens. You know that better than anyone." Evan rested his forehead against hers, feeling the weight of months of work finally lifting. "We did it. We actually built something that didn't destroy us in the process." "We did," Claire agreed. "Though I think building is ongoing. We're not finished yet." "What do you mean?" She pulled back, and there was something in her expression, nervousness and excitement and determination all mixed together. "I've been thinking about what comes next for both of us. Okay? I want to step back from Harrington Global. Not leave entirely, but transition to a less intensive role. Chairman instead of CEO, strategic oversight instead of daily operations." She spoke quickly, like she needed to get it all out before she lost her nerve. "I've spent 15 years building the company. I'm proud of what it's become, especially after the changes we implemented. But I'm ready to build something else now. Evan stared at her, processing. Claire stepping back from her company was like an architect walking away from their masterpiece. Are you sure? This is everything you've worked for. It was everything I worked for, she corrected. But I'm not the same person I was when I started. I have different priorities now, different dreams. She took his hands. I want to study architecture, actually pursue it, not just wonder what could have been. And I want to do it while I'm young enough to build a second career, to create something beyond corporate success. Claire, that's... Evan searched for words. That's incredible. Terrifying and incredible. I know, I've been thinking about it for months, running scenarios and projections like it's a business decision. But it's not a business decision, it's a life decision. And I've spent too long letting business be my life. What brought this on? Watching you write the book, seeing you pursue something that scared you because it mattered more than security. You chose yourself, Evan. You chose the risk of failure over the certainty of staying small, and I want that too. I want to be brave enough to try. Evan pulled her into his arms, feeling something profound shift between them. This wasn't just Claire supporting his dreams anymore. It was both of them supporting each other's growth, willing to risk what they'd built for what they might become. When? He asked. 6 months. I need time to transition leadership, make sure the company is stable. But then I'm applying to architecture school. She laughed, the sound slightly hysterical. I'm 35 years old and I'm going back to school. That's insane, right? It's perfect, Evan said. Scary and uncertain and absolutely perfect. They stood there in the house they'd made together, two people who'd found each other at the worst possible time and somehow made it work anyway. Who'd chosen growth over comfort, honesty over performance, each other over all the logical reasons not to risk it. And Evan realized something important. The story wasn't about quitting his job or Claire showing up in the rain or any single dramatic moment. It was about what came after, the slow, deliberate work of building a life that was actually worth living. The courage to keep choosing each other, keep choosing themselves, keep choosing the messy, uncertain path that led towards something real. I love you, he said. I love you too, Claire replied. Even though you're terrible at making coffee and you leave books everywhere and you sometimes disappear into writing for days at a time. Even though you're intense and demanding and you still occasionally try to schedule romance like it's a business meeting. They both laughed, and it felt like release, like permission, like the recognition that love didn't mean perfection. It meant showing up honestly, supporting each other's growth, and being brave enough to keep building even when the blueprint wasn't clear. Outside, Seattle rain began to fall, the same rain that had been falling the night Claire showed up at his door, the night everything changed. But now it sounded different, not like judgment or endings, but like possibility. Like the promise of growth and new beginnings, and all the things they'd build together in the years ahead. The rain that had started that evening continued through the night, and Evan woke to find Claire already up, sitting at the kitchen table with architecture books spread around her like she was preparing for battle. She'd ordered them weeks ago, she admitted, but had been too scared to actually open them until now. I forgot how much I love this, she said, not looking up from a volume on sustainable design. The precision and creativity, the way buildings can shape entire communities. I forgot I ever wanted this. Evan made coffee, still terrible, but Claire drank it anyway and watched her study like a student cramming for finals. There was something both heartbreaking and beautiful about seeing a woman who'd commanded boardrooms and closed billion-dollar deals approach architecture books with the nervous reverence of someone who'd deferred a dream for 15 years. What if I'm not good enough anymore? She asked suddenly, looking up with vulnerability in her eyes. What if I spent so long building businesses that I lost whatever talent I had for building actual buildings? Then you develop new talent. You're not the same person you were at 20. Maybe that's better. Or maybe I'm too old, too set in my ways. Maybe this is just a midlife crisis dressed up as personal growth. Evan sat across from her, moved one of the books aside so he could see her face clearly. Do you want to study architecture because you're running from something or running towards something? Claire considered the question seriously. Toward. Definitely toward. I want to create things that outlast quarterly reports. I want to see my work in 3 dimensions instead of just spreadsheets and projections. I want... She paused, choosing words carefully. I want to build something beautiful, not just profitable. Then it's not a crisis. It's just a choice. She smiled, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. When did you get so wise? Somewhere between my breakdown and learning to make terrible coffee. He took her hand. But seriously, Claire, you're allowed to want different things than you wanted at 20. You're allowed to change directions. That's not failure, it's evolution. The months that followed tested that conviction more than either of them expected. Claire's announcement that she was stepping back from Harrington Global sent shockwaves through the business community. Board members called emergency meetings. Investors demanded explanations. Business publications ran profiles speculating about her reasons. Was she sick? Burned out? Pushed out by activist shareholders? They can't imagine I'd choose this, Claire said, reading through the latest article that painted her decision as capitulation rather than choice. They can't conceive that someone would walk away from power for something as impractical as architecture school. Sounds familiar, Evan observed. Remember when I quit and everyone assumed I'd had a breakdown? You did have a breakdown. True. But the quitting part was the healthiest decision I'd made in years. They just couldn't see it that way. Claire threw the magazine across the room, a rare loss of composure that made Evan love her more, not less. I hate that I care what they think. I hate that part of me wants to defend my choice, prove it's legitimate, show them I'm not making a mistake. Are you making a mistake? No, but that doesn't stop the doubt. The transition took 6 months of brutal work. Claire had to identify and train her successor, restructure executive leadership, manage board concerns, and maintain company stability while essentially dismantling the role she'd held for a decade. Some nights she came home defeated, convinced she was destroying everything she'd built. Other nights she was energized, excited about the possibilities that came with letting go. Evan supported her through all of it, the same way she'd supported his writing. He listened when she needed to process, gave space when she needed to think, reminded her why she'd made this choice when doubt threatened to overwhelm her. I keep having this nightmare, Claire confessed one sleepless night at 3 a.m. I'm in architecture school and everyone's younger and more talented, and I realize I've given up everything for something I'll never be good at. And in the dream, I can't go back to Harrington Global because I've already handed it over, and I'm just stuck. No company, no career, nothing. That sounds terrifying. It is. What if that's not a nightmare? What if that's a premonition? Evan pulled her closer in the darkness. Then we figure it out together. You're not alone in this, Claire. If architecture school doesn't work out, if you hate it, or you're not good at it, or it's not what you hoped, we adapt. But you'll never know unless you try. You make it sound simple. It's not simple. It's terrifying. But so was showing up at my door in the rain. So was admitting you were in love with your operations director. So was transforming your entire company culture because one essay made you realize you'd been hurting people. He kissed her forehead. You're good at terrifying, Claire. Trust that. The day she officially stepped down as CEO was both devastating and liberating. There was a board meeting, a press release, a company-wide announcement. Claire gave a speech about new directions and continued involvement and confidence in her successor. She smiled and shook hands and projected the same controlled competence she'd always shown. But when she came home that evening, she collapsed on the couch and cried for an hour straight. I just gave away 15 years of my life, she said between sobs. Everything I built, everything I sacrificed for, I just handed it to someone else. Evan held her, let her grieve, didn't try to fix it with platitudes about new beginnings or better opportunities. Sometimes loss needed to be acknowledged, even when it was chosen, even when it was necessary. You didn't give it away, he said when she'd finally cried herself quiet. You transformed it into something sustainable and then trusted other people to continue that work. That's not loss, that's legacy. It doesn't feel like legacy. It feels like failure. I know. It felt that way when I quit too. Like I'd spent 3 years building something that didn't matter because I couldn't sustain it. He shifted so he could see her face. But walking away from Harrington Global is what led me to writing, to you, to this life. Sometimes what feels like failure is actually just the ending of one chapter, so another can begin. Claire was quiet for a long moment, processing. I'm scared, she finally admitted. I've been CEO Claire for so long, I don't know who I am without that identity. What if there's nothing underneath? What if I'm just an empty vessel that was good at running companies and nothing else? Then we find out together. But Claire, I've seen who you are without the CEO mask. I've seen you vulnerable and uncertain and completely human. That person is not empty. She's interesting and complex and worth knowing. You're biased. Completely. But I'm also right. She laughed wetly, wiping her eyes. How did you get through this part? When you first quit and had to figure out who you were outside of work? Badly, Evan admitted. I drank too much beer and avoided my phone and had at least 3 existential crises before noon most days. But eventually I started writing, and that gave me something to build toward instead of just away from. You have that too. Architecture isn't just an escape from corporate life, it's a destination. What if I'm terrible at it? Then you'll be terrible at something you love instead of excellent at something that was destroying you. I'll take that trade. The first day of architecture school arrived with the kind of September sunshine that made Seattle feel almost optimistic. Claire had been anxious for weeks, buying supplies with the intensity she'd once brought to merger negotiations, reviewing prerequisite materials like they were contracts requiring detailed analysis, preparing for her return to academic life like it was a hostile takeover. I'm the oldest person in my cohort by at least a decade, she said, getting dressed in jeans and a sweater that made her look younger but couldn't hide her nervousness. Everyone else will be fresh out of undergrad, full of energy and current with design trends and not worried about whether they remembered how to take notes. You'll be fine. You don't know that. I know that you're brilliant and driven and you care more about this than anyone else in that classroom. That counts for something. Claire kissed him at the door, holding on longer than necessary. Thank you for believing this wasn't crazy, for supporting me even when I was convinced I was making a huge mistake. Same thing you did for me with the book. We're good at that now, supporting each other's terrifying choices. She left, and Evan spent the day writing, trying not to check his phone every 15 minutes to see if she'd texted. When she finally came home that evening, she looked exhausted and exhilarated in equal measure. How was it? He asked. Overwhelming, incredible, completely terrifying. She dropped her bag, pulled him into a kiss that tasted like coffee and relief. I loved every second. The stories poured out over dinner about the professor who'd challenged her assumptions in the first hour, about the studio space that smelled like sawdust and possibility, about the younger students who'd been initially intimidated by her age and experience but warmed up once they realized she was just as lost as they were. There's this kid, Sam, can't be more than 22, who asked what I did before architecture school, and I said I ran a company, and he just nodded like that was completely normal, and then asked if I knew how to use AutoCAD. She laughed, delighted by the memory. No assumptions, no deference, just a practical question about software proficiency. That must have been refreshing. It was. Nobody there cares that I was CEO of Harrington Global. They just care if I can draft a floor plan and understand load-bearing structures. She grabbed his hand across the table. I feel like I can breathe again, Evan. Like I've been holding my breath for 15 years and finally remembered how to exhale. Watching Claire fall in love with architecture was like watching her become a different person, or maybe just become more fully herself. She threw herself into her studies with the same intensity she'd brought to business, but there was joy in it that had been absent from her corporate work. She'd stay up late working on models, get frustrated with technical drawings, debate design philosophy with classmates half her age, and come home covered in dust and completely happy. Look at this, she'd say, showing Evan sketches and renderings and foam core models. Look at how the natural light moves through this space. Look at how the materials create different emotional responses. Isn't it beautiful? And it was beautiful. Not just the work itself, but seeing her so engaged, so present, so fully alive in a way she'd never been while running Harrington Global. But the transition wasn't entirely smooth. 3 months into her program, Claire had a crisis about finances. She'd structured her departure from Harrington Global well, with enough savings and ongoing consulting income to support them both comfortably. But money felt different when it wasn't actively being earned, when it was savings being depleted rather than salary being generated. We're spending down my reserves, she said one evening, reviewing their accounts with the kind of concern that reminded Evan of her CEO days. At this rate, we have maybe 3 years before we'd need to make significant changes. That's 3 years more than most people have, Evan pointed out. And my book is still generating royalties. I'm working on the second one. We're not destitute. I know, but I'm used to building wealth, not spending it. This feels irresponsible. It's not irresponsible to invest in your education and future career. It's just a different kind of investment than you're used to making. Claire closed the laptop, frustrated. I spent 15 years being financially secure. Now I'm a student living off savings while my partner supports us with book royalties. It feels backwards. It feels different, Evan corrected. Not backwards. You supported yourself for 15 years. I'm supporting us now while you build something new. Eventually, you'll support us again when you're working as an architect. It's called partnership, not failure. But what if architecture doesn't work out? What if I spend 3 years in school and come out to find that firms don't want to hire a 38-year-old with no practical experience? What if this whole thing is just an expensive midlife crisis? Evan recognized the fear underlying the financial concerns. This wasn't really about money. It was about the uncertainty of choosing a path that didn't guarantee success, about giving up the security of corporate achievement for the risk of creative pursuit. Remember what you told me when I was scared about writing the book? He asked. You said I had to choose what mattered to me, not what was safe. That advice works both ways, Claire. She nodded slowly, some of the tension easing. I'm not used to being uncertain about my career. I spent 15 years knowing exactly what I was doing, where I was going. This feels like stumbling in the dark. Welcome to the club. We have terrible coffee and existential dread, but the company's pretty good. That surprised a laugh out of her. How do you do that? Make everything feel manageable even when it's terrifying. Practice. Lots and lots of practice failing and surviving and realizing the world doesn't end just because you're uncertain. He pulled her away from the laptop into his arms. We're okay, Claire. Financially, emotionally, all of it. You don't have to have everything figured out right now. The second book was harder to write than the first. Evan had spent the first book processing his own experience, telling a story he knew intimately. The second required more research, more interviews, broader perspective on workplace culture, and systemic change. Some days the writing flowed easily. Other days he'd stare at empty pages, convinced he'd said everything worth saying in the first book. I don't know if I can do this, he confessed to Claire one particularly difficult afternoon. The first book was personal. This one needs to be bigger, more comprehensive. What if I'm not capable of that kind of scope? Claire looked up from her architectural sketches. You're spiraling. I'm realizing my limitations. You're spiraling, she repeated firmly. I've seen you do this before. You convince yourself you can't do something, work yourself into panic, and then eventually break through and do it anyway. So let's skip the panic part and go straight to the breakthrough. It doesn't work that way. Why not? You're choosing to spiral. Choose differently. Evan wanted to argue, but she wasn't wrong. He was falling into familiar patterns, self-doubt, catastrophizing, imagining failure before he'd even properly attempted success. It was comfortable in a perverse way, this spiral. Safe, because if he convinced himself he'd fail, then actual failure would hurt less. How do you do it? He asked. Architecture school, I mean. You're learning completely new skills at an age when most people are established in their careers. How do you push through the doubt? Claire set down her pencil, considered the question seriously. I remind myself why I'm doing this. Not for external validation or financial success, but because I want to create buildings that matter. That purpose makes the doubt bearable. She paused. What's your purpose with this book? Why are you writing it? Because the conversation about workplace culture can't stop with one personal story. Because systemic change requires systemic analysis. Because people need frameworks for understanding and transforming toxic work environments. The words came easier as he found his footing. Because my breakdown was personal, but the culture that caused it is structural. There's your breakthrough. Write that book. The one about systemic analysis and transformation frameworks. Not another personal memoir, but the practical guide people need to actually implement change. Evan sat with that, felt something shift in his understanding of the project. She was right. He'd been trying to replicate the first book's personal intimacy instead of embracing what this book needed to be: analytical, comprehensive, solutions-focused rather than experience-focused. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For seeing what I was missing. For being my partner in this instead of just my cheerleader." Claire smiled. "We're good at that now. Being actual partners instead of just supporting each other from a distance." They were good at it. Over the months and years that followed, they developed rhythms that honored both their needs and their relationship. Claire would come home from studio sessions and decompress by telling Evan about design challenges and creative breakthroughs. Evan would emerge from writing sessions and process ideas about workplace culture, while Claire offered perspectives from her own corporate experience. They supported each other's work without competing, celebrated victories without diminishing them, weathered setbacks without making them catastrophic. "I got an internship offer," Claire announced one spring evening, 2 years into her architecture program. "A firm downtown wants me for the summer. It's not paid much, but the work is incredible. Sustainable housing projects, community development, exactly the kind of architecture I want to practice." "That's amazing," Evan said, genuinely thrilled. "When do you start?" 2 weeks. "But Evan," she hesitated, "it's 40 hours a week on top of my remaining coursework. I'll basically be working full-time while finishing my degree. It's going to be intense." "So we'll figure it out, same way we always do." The summer was brutal. Claire worked exhausting hours, came home covered in construction dust, fell asleep on the couch while reviewing drawings. But she was radiantly happy in a way Evan had never seen during her CEO days. This exhaustion came from creating rather than managing, from building actual structures instead of corporate empires. "Look at this," she'd say, showing him photos of project sites. "We're designing affordable housing that doesn't look like affordable housing. We're creating community spaces that honor the dignity of the people who'll use them. This is what I was supposed to be doing all along." Evan's second book, published that same summer, to strong reviews and solid sales. It wasn't the phenomenon the first one had been, but it established him as a serious voice in conversations about workplace transformation. He started getting consulting offers from companies wanting to implement the frameworks he'd developed, speaking invitations from conferences focused on organizational culture. "You could make a career out of this," Claire observed, reading through his consulting proposals. "Corporate consulting pays well. You could build a whole practice around workplace culture transformation." "I could," Evan agreed, "but I don't want to. I like writing. I like the research and analysis and storytelling. Consulting feels too close to my old life, solving other people's problems instead of exploring my own ideas." "Good. I'm glad you know that about yourself." She set aside the proposals. Too many people make career choices based on what pays well instead of what actually sustains them. "Don't make that mistake just because you could," says the woman who's making poverty wages as an architecture intern. "Exactly. I've done the well-paying career that made me miserable. Never again." They were learning, both of them, what it meant to build lives around purpose instead of prestige. It wasn't always easy. There were financial stresses, moments of doubt, times when the easier path looked very tempting. But there was also joy in the work itself, satisfaction in creating things that mattered, peace in knowing they were building toward something authentic. The real test came when Claire graduated from architecture school and started looking for permanent positions. Despite her stellar academic work and successful internship, many firms were hesitant to hire someone with no practical experience who'd be nearly 40 by the time she completed her licensing requirements. "I had 17 interviews," she said, after a particularly brutal rejection. 17, and every single one ended the same way. "Impressive resume, but we're looking for someone with more traditional trajectory," which is code for younger and cheaper. "Then find the firm that values wisdom over trajectory." What if that firm doesn't exist? What if I spent 3 years and significant savings on a degree that's professionally useless? Evan had no easy answers. This was the risk they'd both taken, walking away from established careers to pursue things that mattered more than money or status. Sometimes that risk paid off. Sometimes it didn't. The outcome wasn't guaranteed, which was terrifying and also kind of the point. "If traditional firms won't hire you, build your own practice," he suggested. "You've started a company before. Start another one, but this time in service of work you actually love." Claire looked at him like he'd suggested something impossibly radical. "Start my own architecture firm? Why not? You have the business skills, you're developing the design skills, and you have enough saved to sustain yourself while building a client base. Plus, you know exactly what kind of workplace culture you want to create. That's insane. Architecture firms take years to establish. The failure rate is astronomical. I'd be competing against practices with decades of experience. All true. Also true. You're Claire Harrington. You built a $500 million company by your mid-30s. You can build an architecture practice. She stared at him, processing. You're serious? Completely. You don't need permission from firms that can't see your value. Create your own firm that values exactly what you bring. Business acumen combined with design vision, commitment to sustainable and dignified spaces, understanding of both corporate and creative cultures. Claire was quiet for a long moment, and Evan could see her mind working, shifting from defeated job seeker to strategic founder. This was who she was at her core. Someone who built things when existing structures didn't serve her needs. I'd need to finish my licensing requirements, she said slowly. Find a licensed architect willing to collaborate until I have my own license. Develop a portfolio that demonstrates my design philosophy. Build a client base from nothing. Sounds hard. Sounds impossible. You're good at impossible. Evan pulled her close. And you're not alone in this. We'll figure it out together, same as everything else. That conversation became the foundation for the next chapter of their lives. Claire stopped looking for traditional employment and started building something new. A small architecture practice focused on sustainable, dignified design for communities typically underserved by high-end firms. She partnered with a recently retired architect who believed in her vision, started taking on small projects, built a portfolio one thoughtful design at a time. It was slow going. Some months they barely scraped by financially, but there was authenticity in the struggle that had been absent from Claire's corporate success. She was building something real, something that aligned with her values, something that would leave a legacy beyond quarterly earnings. I designed a community center today, she said one evening, showing Evan the renderings. For a neighborhood that's been overlooked by developers for decades. The budget is tiny, but we're creating something beautiful anyway, something that honors the people who'll use it. Evan looked at her drawings, simple, elegant, thoughtful in ways that transcended budget constraints. It's perfect. It's the work I was supposed to be doing all along, Claire said quietly. Not building corporate monuments or maximizing shareholder value, but creating spaces that serve actual human needs. This is what success should feel like. What does it feel like? Like I finally know who I am. Not CEO Claire or architecture student Claire or anyone's idea of what I should be. Just Claire, building things that matter with someone who makes me brave enough to try. She kissed him then, soft and certain, and Evan felt the truth of it. They'd both walked away from versions of success that looked impressive but felt hollow. They'd both chosen uncertainty over security, purpose over prestige, each other over all the logical reasons not to risk it. And they'd built something better than either of them could have imagined that rainy night when Claire showed up at his door. A partnership rooted in honesty, a life aligned with their values, love that sustained rather than consumed them. It wasn't the ending they'd expected, but it was exactly the one they'd needed to find. 3 years after Claire started her architecture practice, Evan found her standing in their kitchen at dawn, staring at an email on her phone with an expression he couldn't quite read. "What's wrong?" he asked, moving to put coffee on, even though it would inevitably be terrible. "Nothing's wrong. Actually, something might be very right, which is somehow more terrifying." She turned the phone toward him. "Harrington Global wants to commission me for their new headquarters building." Evan read the email twice, processing the implications. "Your old company wants to hire your new company." "Apparently the board saw my community center design. It won an award last month. Did I mention that? And they want someone who understands both their corporate culture and sustainable design principles." She set down the phone, laughed shakily. "This is insane. I walked away from that company to pursue architecture, and now architecture is bringing me back to them." "Different relationship, though. You're not their CEO anymore. You're their architect." "I know. But Evan, this project, it's massive, $50 million budget, high profile, the kind of commission that could establish my practice as a serious firm. It's also terrifying because if I fail very publicly at the company I used to run. Do you want to do it?" Claire considered the question seriously. the way she approached everything that mattered. Yes, I want to design a building that embodies the cultural transformation we started. I want to create a workspace that actually supports human well-being instead of just maximizing efficiency. I want to prove that corporate architecture doesn't have to be soulless glass boxes. She paused. But I'm scared I can't deliver on something this scale. My practice is still small. This would consume us for at least 2 years. Then we build the capacity to handle it. Hire additional staff, partner with larger firms for technical support, take on the challenge, and grow into it. Evan poured 2 cups of coffee, handed her one. You've done scarier things than design a building, Claire. You've transformed your entire life. This is just architecture. Just architecture, she repeated, smiling. When did $50 million projects become just anything? When you became someone who cares more about creating meaningful spaces than impressive projects. The old you would have seen this as a trophy commission. The current you sees it as an opportunity to build something that matters. She kissed him, tasting like coffee and possibility. When did you get so good at knowing what I need to hear? Around the same time you got good at calling me on my spirals. We've had practice. The Harrington Global Project consumed the next 2 years of their lives in ways that were both challenging and oddly perfect. Claire hired additional architects and designers, brought on consultants for structural and mechanical systems, built a team capable of delivering on the ambitious vision she'd developed. She worked long hours again, but this time the exhaustion felt different, creative rather than depleting, building toward something rather than just managing endless crises. Evan supported her through the process while working on his 3rd book, a deeper exploration of how physical workspace design impacts organizational culture. He interviewed Claire's team, studied the Harrington Global Project, examined how architecture could either reinforce or transform workplace dynamics. The book and the building developed in parallel, each informing the other. Look at this, Claire would say, showing him design details. Natural light in every workspace, regardless of hierarchy. Collaboration spaces that don't require people to sacrifice privacy. Materials that are sustainable and beautiful, proving you don't have to choose between ethics and aesthetics. It's the physical manifestation of everything you learned about corporate culture, Evan observed. The building is teaching the same lessons your transformation as CEO taught. Exactly. I couldn't see it when I was running the company, how much the physical space reinforced toxic patterns. Glass offices that created visibility but not trust. Conference rooms designed for confrontation instead of collaboration. Workspaces that prioritize density over dignity. She traced her fingers over the renderings. This building will tell a different story about what success looks like. The design process wasn't without conflict. Some Harrington Global board members pushed back against Claire's more radical ideas. The abundant natural light reduced rentable square footage. The emphasis on employee wellness spaces seemed like wasted investment. The sustainable materials cost more upfront than conventional alternatives. They want me to compromise the design to maximize their return on investment, Claire said after a particularly contentious board meeting. They hired me because I understand their culture, then want me to perpetuate the same values I spent years trying to change. What did you tell them? That they could hire a different architect if they wanted a conventional corporate building. But if they wanted the building I'm capable of designing, one that actually reflects the cultural transformation they claim to value, they need to trust my vision. She rubbed her temples. I might have been too harsh. I might have just talked myself out of the biggest commission of my career. Or you reminded them why they hired you in the first place. Because you're willing to tell uncomfortable truths about what they actually need versus what they think they want. The board, after a week of deliberation, agreed to Claire's terms. Not all of them. Some compromises were necessary, but enough that the essential vision remained intact. Construction began on schedule, and Claire spent months on site, solving problems and managing contractors and ensuring that the building taking shape matched the one she'd imagined. Evan visited the construction site regularly, watching the building rise from foundation to frame to enclosed structure. There was something profound about seeing Claire's vision become three-dimensional reality, about watching ideas become steel and glass and carefully considered spaces. "This is what you were supposed to be doing," he said one afternoon, standing with her in what would become the building's central atrium, a soaring space flooded with natural light, designed to be a community gathering place rather than just a transit corridor. I know. I can feel it in my bones. This is the work I was meant for. She looked up at the exposed structural elements, the elegant engineering solutions that would soon be hidden behind finished surfaces. But I couldn't have gotten here without first being CEO Claire. I needed to understand corporate culture from the inside before I could design buildings that transform it. So the detour through business wasn't actually a detour. No, it was preparation. All those years I thought I was deferring my dreams, I was actually developing skills I'd need to realize them in ways I couldn't have imagined at 20. She took his hand. Same as you. You couldn't have written books about workplace culture without first burning out in that world. Your breakdown wasn't failure. It was education. They stood there in the skeleton of a building that would house hundreds of workers, a structure designed to support human flourishing rather than just economic productivity, and Evan felt the symmetry of their journeys. They'd both had to lose themselves to find themselves, had to walk away from success to discover what success should actually mean. The building opened 18 months later to national attention. Architecture publications praised its innovative design, business magazines celebrated its commitment to employee wellness, sustainability organizations recognized its environmental achievements. But the response that mattered most to Claire came from the Harrington Global employees who worked there. "People keep sending me messages," she said, reading through emails on her phone, "thanking me for creating a workspace that doesn't feel oppressive, telling me they're less stressed, more creative, actually enjoying being at work." Her eyes filled with tears. This one woman said she used to dread coming to the office, but now she arrives early just to sit in the atrium and drink coffee before her day starts, because the space makes her feel valued instead of monitored. "You built something that honors people's dignity," Evan said. "That's not just good architecture, that's transformation." His third book published around the same time the building opened, and the timing created unexpected synergy. Evan's writing about how physical space shapes organizational culture was illustrated perfectly by Claire's building. They did joint presentations, wrote collaborative articles, became a case study in how personal transformation and professional evolution could intersect. "We've become an example," Claire observed after a particularly well-attended conference talk. "People see us as proof that you can walk away from toxic success and build something better." Does that bother you? Sometimes. I don't like being held up as inspirational when most days I still feel like I'm figuring things out. She paused. But I also remember how alone I felt when I first started questioning whether corporate success was enough. If our story helps someone else feel less alone in that questioning, maybe being an example is okay. They were examples, but they were also just people trying to build lives that felt authentic. Some days were triumphant. New commissions for Claire's firm, speaking invitations for Evan, recognition that their work mattered. Other days were ordinary, even boring. Grocery shopping and laundry and the mundane maintenance of existence. "I think I like the boring days best," Evan admitted one quiet Sunday morning. They were both working, Claire sketching preliminary designs for a library project, Evan editing chapters of his fourth book, but working in comfortable silence, occasionally sharing ideas or asking for opinions, mostly just existing together. "Why the boring days?" Claire asked, looking up from her drawings. "Because they're ours. Not performing for anyone, not proving anything, just being together without agenda or audience." He set down his laptop. "We spent so many years making every moment strategic, every choice calculated for maximum impact. These boring mornings feel radical by comparison." Claire moved from her chair to the couch beside him, tucked herself against his side. "I never thought I'd be someone who valued ordinary over extraordinary. But you're right. This feels more real than anything I achieved as a CEO. Do you miss it? Running Harrington Global, the power and influence, being able to make decisions that affected thousands of people?" She considered the question honestly. "Sometimes. Mostly I miss the clarity of it, knowing exactly what success looked like, having metrics to measure against, the certainty that came with established systems." She paused. "But I don't miss who I had to be to maintain that success. Don't miss the loneliness or the constant performance or the way I'd sacrificed everything personal for professional achievement. No regrets about walking away? None. Well, maybe some regrets about how long it took me to walk away. But the walking away itself? Best decision I ever made. Second best, anyway. What's the best? Showing up at your door in the rain, taking the terrifying risk of admitting I was in love with my operations director. She tilted her head to look at him. Everything good in my life traces back to that moment of vulnerability. Evan kissed her forehead, overwhelmed by the truth of it. That rainy night 4 years ago had seemed like an ending, the end of his career, the collapse of everything he'd built. But it had actually been a beginning. The beginning of honesty, of building something real, of two people choosing each other despite every logical reason not to. We should do something crazy, Claire said suddenly. Define crazy. I don't know, something spontaneous and completely impractical, something that serves no strategic purpose except joy. She sat up, energized by the idea. When's the last time either of us did something just because we wanted to, without calculating the return on investment? Evan thought about it and couldn't remember. Even his writing, which he loved, served purposes beyond personal satisfaction, building a career, contributing to important conversations, establishing himself as an expert. When had he last done something purely for pleasure? What did you have in mind? He asked. Claire's smile was mischievous, reminding him of that first night in the terrible bar when she'd admitted she didn't know how to be anything except strategic. Let's buy motorcycles and take a road trip. No destination, no schedule, just open highways and wherever we end up. You don't know how to ride a motorcycle. Neither do you. We'll learn. It'll be terrifying and impractical and completely wonderful. It was possibly the most Claire suggestion ever, taking something spontaneous and immediately making it a project to execute. But Evan found himself grinning, caught up in the recklessness of it. Okay, he said. Let's do it. They spent 3 weeks learning to ride motorcycles, taking lessons from a gruff instructor who didn't care that Claire had been a CEO or that Evan had written best-selling books. He cared whether they could handle a bike safely, and he pushed them both until they could. Then they bought 2 used motorcycles, nothing fancy, just reliable machines that could handle long distances, and planned their impractical adventure. Where are we going? Evan asked the morning they left, both of them dressed in riding gear that felt foreign and exciting. East, Claire decided. We'll head east until we don't want to anymore, then turn around and come home. They rode through the Cascade Mountains as summer turned the peaks golden, through small towns that existed mostly for logging and tourism, past lakes that reflected impossible blue skies. They stayed in cheap motels and expensive resorts, ate at diners and food trucks, talked to strangers who had no idea who they were or what they'd accomplished. I feel anonymous, Claire said one evening, sitting outside a motel somewhere in Montana. Like I could be anyone, not specifically Claire Harrington with all the baggage that name carries. You are anyone, Evan pointed out. That's the whole point. You're just a person on a motorcycle, seeing the country, building a life that fits who you actually are. They rode for 3 weeks, covering thousands of miles, and something shifted during that journey. The constant motion, the physical challenge of handling the bikes, the enforced simplicity of carrying only what fit in their saddlebags, it all stripped away the complexity they'd accumulated in building their new lives. I think I've been making this too complicated, Claire said one night in Wyoming, lying on her back looking at stars that were impossible to see in Seattle. Architecture, my practice, trying to prove I made the right choice. I've been so focused on succeeding at this new thing that I forgot to just enjoy it. What would enjoying it look like? Taking on fewer projects. Choosing work based on what excites me instead of what builds my reputation. Trusting that success will follow from doing good work instead of strategically pursuing success. She turned to look at him. Learning from you, basically. You write because you love it, and success follows. I've been doing the opposite, chasing success and hoping fulfillment follows. To be fair, I learned that from my breakdown. Hard-won lesson, not inherent wisdom. Still counts as wisdom. She reached for his hand. I want to build a life, not just a career. I want mornings like today where we rode for hours without talking, just experiencing the world together. I want to prioritize presence over productivity. That's a very un-Claire-like goal. Good. I've been Claire Harrington long enough. Time to figure out who Claire Brooks could be. The name caught Evan off guard. They'd been together 4 years, lived together for 3, built integrated lives and shared dreams. But they'd never discussed marriage, never even used language that suggested future formalization of their relationship. Claire Brooks? He repeated carefully. She sat up, suddenly nervous in a way he rarely saw anymore. Or you could be Evan Harrington, or we could both keep our names, or... She stopped, started again. I'm doing this backwards, aren't I? I should have asked first instead of just assuming you'd want to... Yes, Evan interrupted. Yes, what? Yes, I want to marry you. Yes to Claire Brooks or Evan Harrington, or keeping our own names. Yes to formalizing what we've been building for 4 years. He pulled her close. You really thought I might say no? I thought you might think it was too conventional, too traditional for what we've built together. It's not about convention. It's about choosing each other, publicly and formally, the same way we've been choosing each other privately every day. He kissed her under impossible stars. I love you. I want to marry you. I want to build the rest of our lives together. Even though I'm intense and difficult, and I still occasionally try to optimize things that shouldn't be optimized, especially because of those things, you wouldn't be you without them. They got married 3 months later in a small ceremony that was nothing like what either of them would have chosen in their previous lives. No elaborate wedding, no guest list designed for networking, no performance of success, just close friends and family, simple vows about honesty and partnership, a commitment to keep choosing each other through whatever came next. I can't believe we're doing this, Claire said the morning of the wedding, getting dressed in their bedroom. Getting married feels so conventional after everything else we've done. Marriage is only conventional if you do it conventionally, Evan pointed out. We're not promising to be perfect partners or maintain some idealized version of romance. We're promising to keep being honest, keep supporting each other's growth, keep building something real. That's a good vow. You should use that in your speech. I'm not giving a speech. We agreed. Simple ceremony, no speeches. I changed my mind. I want to hear you promise those things in front of everyone. So Evan promised them, promised honesty and support and the continued work of building something real. Claire promised the same things in her own words, adding that she promised to keep taking terrifying risks if Evan promised to keep calling her on her spirals. They exchanged rings that were simple and meaningful, kissed to applause from the small gathering, and officially became partners in all the ways that mattered. The years that followed weren't perfect, but they were authentic. Claire's architecture practice grew steadily, taking on projects that aligned with her values: affordable housing, community centers, schools designed to support student wellness. She earned enough to be comfortable but not wealthy, and she was happier than she'd ever been during her days of corporate success. Evan wrote more books, each one exploring different aspects of workplace culture and human flourishing. He consulted occasionally, but stayed focused on writing, trusting that the work itself was valuable even when it didn't generate immediate income. His books didn't all become bestsellers, but they all contributed to conversations he cared about. They fought sometimes, about Claire's tendency to overwork, about Evan's occasional withdrawal when writing consumed him, about whose turn it was to handle household tasks they both tended to neglect. But they fought honestly, without the defensive walls that had characterized their early conflicts, willing to admit fault and adjust course. We're good at this now, Evan observed one evening, 7 years after that rainy night when Claire had shown up at his door. They were sitting on their back deck, watching the Seattle sunset paint the sky in colors that seemed impossible. Good at what? Being partners, supporting each other without losing ourselves, building a life instead of just managing competing careers. Claire leaned against him, solid and warm and completely present. We've had practice. Lots of practice failing and trying again. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't quit? If we just kept working together, maintained professional distance? Sometimes. Usually late at night when I can't sleep. She paused. I think we would have been miserable. You would have eventually had a worse breakdown. I would have kept building a company I didn't really care about. We would have stayed locked in professional roles that didn't leave room for being human. So me quitting was the best thing that could have happened. For both of us. Your breakdown forced us both to examine what we actually wanted from life. Made us brave enough to choose something better than just successful. They sat there as the sky darkened. Two people who'd found each other at exactly the wrong time and somehow made it exactly right. Who'd walked away from versions of success that looked impressive but felt hollow. who'd built something better in the wreckage of their former lives. "I want to show you something," Claire said, standing and offering her hand. She led him to her home office, where architectural drawings covered every surface. But she pulled out a specific set of renderings, a small building, elegantly simple, surrounded by open space. "What is this?" Evan asked. "A writer's retreat center. Sustainable design, individual cabins for privacy, shared spaces for community. A place where people could come to work on projects that matter, supported by an environment designed to nurture creativity instead of demanding productivity." She looked at him nervously. "I want to build it. Use some of our savings, take out a loan for the rest. Create something that serves the kind of work you do, the kind of transformation we both experienced." Evan studied the drawings, seeing the care in every detail, the natural light, the thoughtful proportions, the way indoor and outdoor spaces flowed together. "This would be expensive, risky. We'd be gambling our financial security on something with uncertain return." "I know, which is why I'm asking instead of just doing it. This affects both of us." He thought about the person he'd been 7 years ago, burned out and desperate, unable to imagine a future that didn't feel like drowning. Thought about the person Claire had been, successful and lonely, running from dreams she'd convinced herself were impractical. They'd both walked away from safety to find something real, and that choice had led to everything good in their lives. "Let's build it," he said. "Really?" "Really. We've taken bigger risks for less certain outcomes. At least this time we're risking together." The retreat center took 2 years to build and another year to establish as a functioning organization. They poured time and money and energy into creating a space that embodied everything they'd learned about supporting human creativity and growth. Some months they barely broke even, but the people who came to write and think and create in the space Claire had designed, they transformed in ways that reminded Evan and Claire of their own transformations. "This is what it was all for," Claire said, watching a group of writers share their work in the retreat's common area. "Not the architecture prizes, or the book sales, or any external validation. This, creating space for people to become who they're meant to be." "We built something that matters," Evan agreed, "not despite walking away from conventional success, but because we walked away. We couldn't have created this from inside our old lives." They were 10 years into their relationship when Evan finally felt like he understood what they'd built together. It wasn't the romance of movies or novels. There were no dramatic declarations or grand gestures, no perfect certainty or guaranteed happily ever after. What they had was better than that fantasy. They had partnership rooted in honesty, love that had survived through multiple transformations, commitment to keep choosing each other even when it was hard. "Do you remember that first night?" Claire asked, lying in bed on the anniversary of the day she'd shown up at his door. "When I showed up soaking wet and told you I was in love with you? I remember thinking you were completely insane, and that I was completely in love with you despite knowing it was a terrible idea. It was a terrible idea. We had every reason not to try, and we tried anyway. Best terrible idea ever." She kissed him, soft and certain. "Thank you for opening the door. For letting me in even though it was raining and late and completely inappropriate. Thank you for showing up, for being brave enough to risk rejection, vulnerable enough to admit you wanted something beyond professional success." They fell asleep tangled together, two people who'd found each other in the wreckage of their old lives and built something better than either could have imagined. Who'd learned that success wasn't about power or prestige or any external measure, but about living authentically, loving honestly, and having the courage to keep choosing growth over comfort. The next morning, Evan woke early and made coffee, still terrible after all these years, but Claire drank it anyway. They sat on their deck watching the sunrise over Seattle, planning their day with the casual intimacy of people who'd learned to exist together without losing themselves. "Should we take the bikes out this weekend?" Claire suggested. "Just ride somewhere without destination, see where we end up?" "Sounds perfect. No agenda, no productivity goals, just being together." "We've gotten good at that. Being together without trying to optimize it into something strategic." "Practice," Evan said, the same answer he always gave. "Lots of practice." They finished their terrible coffee and started their ordinary day, Two people living an extraordinary, ordinary life. And Evan realized that this quiet morning, this comfortable partnership, this life built on honesty instead of performance, this was what he'd been searching for during all those years of drowning in corporate success. He'd quit his job to save himself and found Claire in the wreckage. She'd walked away from her company to find herself and discovered partnership in the process. They'd both learned that the door you close on an old life can open onto something better, but only if you're brave enough to step through it, vulnerable enough to admit you're scared, and committed enough to keep building even when the outcome isn't certain. The rain started falling again that afternoon, gentle Seattle rain that felt like benediction instead of judgment. They rode their motorcycles through it anyway, laughing like people who'd learned that getting soaked wasn't failure, just part of the journey. Who understood that love wasn't about staying dry and safe, but about choosing someone brave enough to ride through storms beside you. And somewhere between the rain and the road and the years they'd spent building something real, Evan finally understood what Claire had given him that night she showed up at his door. Not just love or partnership or any single definable thing, but permission. Permission to want more than survival, to build a life instead of just a career, to believe that the person he was becoming mattered more than the person he'd been told to be. "I love you," he said, pulling up beside her at a stoplight. "I love you too," Claire replied, rain streaming down her face, looking nothing like the powerful CEO who'd commanded boardrooms and everything like the woman who'd risked everything to tell the truth. The light changed. They accelerated into the afternoon, two people who'd learned that the best journeys don't have destinations, the best love doesn't have guarantees, and the best life is the one you build honestly, one choice at a time, with someone brave enough to open the door when it matters most.